We good? Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlie Whelan. I'm the faculty director for the Center for Business, Government, and Society at Tuck, and as well as a clinical professor of business down there. In a few minutes, I'm going to welcome and call to the stage Governor Josh Stein, class of 1988, and Dave Duckenfield, class of 1988, and of course, to round out the trio, I also a member of the class of 88, and I want to point out that we've got some others out there that we make up 2% of the nation's governors and 1% of the Senate, which is pretty good. Pretty good for a single class, but it's great to have you on campus, great to have some fellow classmates with us as well. We will save time for audience Q&A, and we'll prioritize student questions when we do that. When we get to that part of the program, and for the whole program, please raise your hand, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. We ask that you wait for the microphone before you ask your question, and that so our virtual audiences can hear what you say as well. As a reminder, Dartmouth is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. With that, we would ask that you do not interfere with or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guests and moderators. So let me start off by introducing my co-moderator for this evening, Dave Duckenfield, who is president and partner at Bolsera Communications, where he focuses on new business development, strategic management of client accounts, and day-to-day management of the firm. He has 20 years of experience in public diplomacy, corporate and marketing communications, brand building, crisis communications, and public policy. Between 2014 and 2016, David was a senior official in the Obama administration, where he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Public Affairs. In that role, he oversaw the offices of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs, which engaged the American public and state and local elected officials on foreign policy priorities of the administration. David obtained an MA in Latin American Studies and International Economics from Johns Hopkins, and earned a BA, obviously, from Dartmouth in history, and he graduated from Phillips Andover as well. Now, our guest of honor tonight, our classmate, Governor Josh Stein. Governor Stein was called to public service by his faith and his family. His faith teaches him that we're all called to make a difference, and his parents raised his brother, sister, and him to try to do what is right, like they did, and grounded them in our shared values of freedom and opportunity for everyone. As Attorney General, Josh and his team have cleared the nation's largest backlog of untested rape kits, tackled the opioid and fentanyl crises, defended the people's fundamental freedoms. As governor, Josh has helped to bring the state together to help Western North Carolina after the terrible Hurricane Helene, which I think we're going to talk about, create economic opportunity for all people in the state, invest in public schools, and keep people safe. He and his wife, Anna, live in Raleigh and are members of Temple Beth Orr. They're proud parents of Sam Adam, who's a student of mine. It's too late to litigate any grades. So I like dealing with parents, but only in this context. And they all attended North Carolina public schools, just like Josh did. Please join me in warmly welcoming both Governor Stein and my classmate, David Duckenfield. Josh. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dave. I keep calling him Duck. I'm going to try and avoid that.
Here we go.
Turn it over to David.
No jokes.
To launch us here.
We were trying to think, Charlie and I were like, we can come up with a funny joke about how many Dartmouth 88s does it take to screw in a light bulb or something. We do
a lot, because they're all busy in the Senate and running the country. That's the answer.
But welcome, Josh, Governor Stein. I'd like to start off by saying how proud we are as 88s of Dartmouth and Dartmouth College of what you've accomplished in your amazing career and now being the newly elected governor of North Carolina. And I thought we'd start off the evening talking about that, just highlights of how you got there, your years in the Senate and the state, and then as AG and now as the newly elected governor of North Carolina.
I'd be happy to do it. And I'm going to call him Duck whether you do or not.
It's just, you might as well start doing it.
And my wife Anna is here, and you missed one bit because I have 3 kids, and the third one's here, Leah Stein. She's the 26th here at Dartmouth. I came to Dartmouth because of how I was raised, knowing I wanted to do something in the public sector. or rather public service. There are lots of different ways you can serve the public, obviously. And I taught in Africa for a couple years after college, came home and got a joint law and public policy degree, and then wanted to get into community economic development, and did get into community economic development, doing affordable housing development and investing capital in small businesses and low wealth communities in Eastern North Carolina, and loved that work. But then had the opportunity to join a campaign of a lawyer who was running for U.S. Senate in 1998, a guy named John Edwards, and did that and enjoyed it immensely. And really by happen chance, I sort of failed up. I was hired as the research director and realized I needed to have somebody who knew what that meant, and I hired a good young kid to do that, so they promoted me to communications director. Realized it would be good to have somebody who knew what they were doing in comms, so I hired somebody to do that, so they made me deputy campaign manager, and then they didn't like the deputy campaign manager, so I became campaign manager. But we won that race, the only challenger to beat an incumbent that cycle for a Democrat, and lived in DC for a couple years, thought I was gonna like it, really didn't like working in the US Senate. It was not a collaborative work environment. People, very territorial, very much elbows. I'm much more of a cooperative person. And so Ann and I, we moved back to North Carolina in 2000 and got a job working for the newly elected Attorney General then, a guy named Roy Cooper, who served 4 terms as Attorney General, 16 years. And for the first 8 of them, I headed the Consumer Protection Division for him, which was an incredible experience and opportunity. In that time, I spent a lot of time at the General Assembly working on anti-predatory lending laws, payday lending laws, identity theft, privacy laws. And so I had a lot of visibility into how the General Assembly worked. And I had broader interests than just consumer protection, healthcare, education, energy policy. And so a seat came open in '08, and I ultimately decided to run for it for the state Senate and won. Did that for 8 years. And then the AG seat came open because Cooper was leaving it to run for governor. And I'd had 8 years in the Senate, I had 8 years in the AG's office, and I felt I was our best chance as Democrats to win, and ran and won by a whopping 23,000 votes out of 5 million, and then ran for re-election in 2020, a lot of unfinished business on really important issues, opioids, coal ash settlement with Duke Energy, the largest rape kit backlog, which Charlie mentioned, a settlement with Juul, the e-cigarette manufacturer. And I got all of that stuff done in year 5, which was very satisfying to actually finish the work, because your term is 4 years, but work can go 5, 7 years. It's not limited to an electoral term. And then ran for governor last year. So basically what I've learned is that I can do things for 8 years till I get bored and move on to the next thing. 8 years in the AG's office, 8 years in the Senate, 8 years in the AG's office, and we'll see what happens in the governor's office.
Great.
So I didn't realize that you'd entered into a settlement with Juul, but I'm going to make another plug for the 88s. Former HHS Secretary Alex Azar, class of 88, also was instrumental in the Trump administration in taking on smokeless tobacco. So it's kind of interesting that the 2 of you both played an interesting role in that. 100%. You mentioned the Democrats. I should point out you're a Democrat who won in a state that Trump carried, and we'll talk more about the specifics of that. We're in a state that was the opposite, a state that Biden carried, and we have a Republican governor.
Harris carried.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. A lot to unpack there.
Lot to unpack.
So let's start unpacking it. You know, where are the Democrats now in terms of creating a narrative, messaging, political strategy that transcends just reacting to Trump on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis?
So Trump won in 16, 20, and 24 in North Carolina, and I won in 16, 20, and 24. I was the only Democratic Attorney General in the country to win a state Trump won twice, and the only Democratic governor actually that's not true, because I was the only one who was up this year. There are other Democratic governors who didn't run this year who represent swing states that Trump won. But this time I won. The first race I won by 0.5 point. Second race I won by 1/4 point. This time I won by 15 points. So that was better. I like 15 points way better. The night is much better when you learn early that you've won. I can tell you that much. But for me, it's just not it's not really complicated. And I'm not a political theorist. I'm a practitioner. And the way I see it is if you talk about issues that voters care about, and I talked a lot about economics, making sure the economy works for people. People have a chance to succeed even in their hometown, even if it's a small town. Great workforce opportunities, cutting taxes for working families, putting more money in their pockets, making sure neighborhoods are safe, combating the fentanyl epidemic, which has absolutely devastated North Carolina as it has much of the country. And I talked about those things, but then I also talked about my track record as Attorney General, where I had proof points of my ability to work across the aisle with Republicans on issues that mattered and made a difference. Like, we can point to things that are better from the time I served as Attorney General. And that's what I think voters want, is they just want to know that you care about the same issues they care about, that you're going to work hard on them, and you have the ability to actually affect some change, some positive change. And that's it. Like, I don't think it's more complicated than that.
It seems it's complicated by social media and other things, so that when candidates talk about those bread and butter issues, these shiny little objects come dragged often by people whose jobs are made easier or more exciting or better ratings by trolling those shiny objects. So how do you get the party to not go for the shiny objects and focus on the stuff that presumably would carry the day?
I mean, it is hard because in different states, there are different incentives. North Carolina is a swing state, 50-50, I mean, truly 50-50. Like, we have elect 10 members to the Council of State, which are, all the statewide executive offices. Half, 5 were Democrats, 5 were Republicans, just this last election. The one Supreme Court race decided by 750 votes out of 5 million votes. So it's a 50-50 state. And I think that actually creates an environment where you have permission as a Democrat and as a statewide Republican to talk to people in the middle, because they're the ones who ultimately decide who wins and who loses. Whereas if you're in a blue state, you have the incentive to win the primary, or if you're in a red state, you have the incentive to win the primary, and so you talk more to the base. Because once you win the primary, the odds are very high that you'll win. And then kind of writ small, that's the evil of gerrymandering, is that it makes members of Congress or members of state legislators not accountable to the median voter, but to the median primary voter. And they tend to be much more conservative or much more liberal than the median voter. And so you end up having representation in Congress that is much more to the right than even Republicans are, or much more to the left than where the median Democrat is. And we have this polarization, and this is where I will be a political scientist, and because I'm not, I can just speak directionally true. I don't remember the actual numbers, but it was a graph that showed U.S. Congress in like 1984, and it had a scatter shot of the Republicans and the Democrats, and the most conservative Democrat was here, and the most liberal Republican was here, and there were 75 members in the middle. Today, there are 0. The most liberal Republican is far to the right than the most conservative Democrat. And so if you have 0 overlap, it becomes very hard to find any Venn diagram. And in fact, the incentives are all wrong, that if you do come up with a compromise, then they come at you like sharks in the primary.
Yeah, we're old enough to remember when primary was just a noun, not a verb.
Yeah, they come after you, they primary you 100%.
Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about governing, since we're talking about that. And, with the first 30, 40 days of the new administration, I think it's clear to say not everyone can agree on all the frenetic pace of what it means and sort of chaos that's out there. But one theme that has come through is this whole concept of the unitary executive theory, or the expansive powers of the executive branch through executive orders, through all these sort of mass firings, not paying contracts and everything. And the Trump administration has taken a view that their branch of government is, trumps, no pun intended, all the others. And right. You live in a sort of mirror version of that down in North Carolina, where the legislative branch has taken the tack that they're going to take more power from the executive branch and sort of denude your powers to do even appointing certain people. So can you talk a little bit about that reality and how it compares to what's going on in D.C.?
Yeah, I mean, it will shock y'all to know that intellectual consistency is not what drives what's going on in Washington and in Raleigh. You have Republicans in power in Washington and Republicans in power in the legislature in Raleigh. And in Washington, to your point, Trump is acting in contravention to acts of Congress, which to me is an intrusion of the separation of powers as articulated in our U.S. Constitution, a violation of the law, in many instances, firing people where the statute is clear that you can't fire somebody unless there's cause. And one guy who's out there in the courts right now is Hampton Dellinger, who's one of the special counsels, and I grew up with Hampton. We went to school together in Chapel Hill, so I'm cheering him on and proud of him for holding tight to what the law says. So, but then in Raleigh, we have a Republican legislature and a Democratic governor. So their attitude is we're going to take the powers away from the executive, and we're going to actually intrude on the authority of the judiciary. They're appointing judges now. They gave themselves the authority to appoint judges. So we have a legislature that's amassing power. In Washington, it's an executive that's amassing power. But the only thing that's common there is the word power. And that's what's driving it in both times. It's not some philosophy of governance. It's truly power.
And how are you going to govern through that?
What you have to do, well, first of all, when they do unconstitutional acts, which they have done to take away power to me that the Constitution gives me, I go to court. And so I've got 3 cases going currently in which I'm asserting they're violating the state separation of powers and separation of powers in our state constitution. Those will be litigated, and we'll see how they turn out. But I got into this position because I want to do things for people. I want things to be better for people on a lot of different fronts 4 years from now than they are today. And the way you do that is you work in partnership. So you cannot go into politics if you can't compartmentalize. You got to be able to say, we're fighting on this issue today. We're going to put it in a drawer because tomorrow we got to work together on Hurricane Helene relief, or on the next big economic development project, or workforce development, or public safety, or access to health care, or protecting people's right to vote. That one may be harder to work on together. But the point is there are a lot of issues where there is the potential for common ground. And if all you are is in fight mode, you'll never find that common ground. You'll never get there. So it just, in part, it requires a personality type who can do that.
Mm-hmm. So can you walk us through some specifics? I mean, these are people here on a Friday at 5 o'clock. Yeah, so this is a pretty wonky crowd here. So go deeper on some of those things. Pick an issue and walk us through how you can turn to people you've fought on other days and get to a place that's better for the citizens of North Carolina.
So at the end of last year, the legislature passed laws that took away my ability to control the Board of Elections, which is a clear executive authority. And they did it, they gave it to the Republican auditor. An auditor, there's no state in the country where the auditor oversees elections. It just so happens that he's a Republican. So they took it from me and gave it to him because they had previously tried to take it from the governor and give it to themselves. And a Republican Supreme Court struck that down as an unconstitutional violation of separation of powers. Then they went with a constitutional amendment in 2018 to give themselves appointment power. That was defeated by the voters by like 60-some% of the vote. And then now they have this new iteration where they're trying to take over power. So I fight with them on that. The President Pro Tem, head of the Senate, very powerful guy, had a meeting with him at the governor's mansion 2 weeks ago. And we're talking about Hurricane Helene relief because we've got to come up with a plan to help people who experienced unbelievable damage in Western North Carolina. And that exists, and he has an interest in helping those people, and I have an interest in helping those people, independent of the fact that he wants to take powers away from me that I don't believe he should. And it's not just that I want to exercise those powers. I think it is absolutely bad for the health of democracy. The reason we have separation of powers is so that it doesn't concentrate in one branch's authority or one person's authority, because then they have the power to do other bad things, and that will then undermine the sort of stability of society and the ability of the economy to continue to grow. So I think there's real long-term damage being inflicted here, but I still got to work with them on Hurricane Helene relief.
Maybe we'll jump back into Hurricane Helene and talk about maybe working with them towards getting some kind of relief to North Carolina, but take it to a broader sense. Back to the frenetic pace of sort of chaos that's been going on the past 30 days. Part of that's FEMA's gotten hit pretty hard and had people laid off. And you were describing earlier today in one of the classes, I mean, the numbers are staggering. I didn't even know them, that there's $90 billion worth of damage to a state that has a $30 billion annual.
It was $60 billion in damage for a $30 billion state budget.
And how does that play out? And how are you going to work with the federal government on that? And one bright spot that we talked about was the fact that President Trump has named you as a co-chair to the National Council of Governors, and has even evoked your name in a positive light, which is for now, which is a good thing. So can you talk through that a little bit?
So my standard for deciding what I should do at any point is, what do I think is going to help people in North Carolina? And anybody who is going to take a position on something that is going to help the people of North Carolina, I will ally with them. If they're going to take positions that hurt the people of North Carolina, I will stand up and say, I think this is wrong, and here's why I think it's wrong, and here's what I'm going to do in opposition to what you're trying to do. The president's first trip out of Washington, D.C., post-inauguration, was to North Carolina. He came to Asheville, toured the damage, and I met him at the airport and talked to him and made our request for financial assistance, because the damage is just of a scope that's hard to comprehend. It's $60 billion, over 100 lives lost. It's just massive, and the geography is from one side of the state to the other, from north to south, and we need help. We need the federal government's help, and so I made that case to him when he came, and he toured the damage and was rightly troubled by the amount of debris that was still on the ground 3 months later, and so he's lit a fire under the Army Corps of Engineers, lit a fire under FEMA. And I thanked him for that and acknowledged it publicly. That doesn't mean when he says things about FEMA that I think are untrue, I say what he's saying, I have no evidence that what he said is accurate. And he last week tapped me to, as you know, co-chair this Council of Governors, of which there are 10 governors, 5 Ds, 5 Rs, and I'm co-chairing it with Glenn Youngkin, the Republican governor of Virginia. And it focuses on National Guard, national security, cybersecurity, disaster relief, fighting fentanyl epidemic, things that the federal government and states in our federal system have to be able to work together on. And so I am right there, and I will work with them on all those issues. Meanwhile, what they've done on NIH funding is just devastating to people who are in the clinical trials for life-saving medicines, but also devastating to North Carolina. We're number 6 in NIH funding. We have Duke, UNC, NC State, just all in the triangle, all these biopharmaceutical nonprofits and corporations. And if these cuts are made, people will die because of them, and our economy will really suffer in North Carolina. It's like part of the beating heart of the economy. And so I've been very clear to the administration that I think what they're doing is wrong there, and supported our Attorney General's lawsuit to get an injunction against them for that, because it was an act of Congress to appropriate the funds for that purpose. And so the president, in my view, does not have the power to overturn an act of Congress.
But you've stayed in his good graces for the most part. So, I mean, can we call you like a Democratic Trump whisperer? Is there advice out there for other Democrats who need to work with the White House in the long run? I mean, there's just no option.
I think I'm well trained from being in North Carolina, where I've had a Republican legislature, and I would never have been able to eliminate the backlog of untested rape kits without the legislature's partnership. We enacted a number of comprehensive laws to fight the opioid crisis that would not have happened without partnership with the Republicans. we modernized our the laws protecting kids from child sex abuse would not have happened without Republican partnership. So I think one thing about being in a purple state is you get trained in how you work with people, and you learn to, as I said before, compartmentalize things. You don't respond to every shiny object, as you said earlier, because then it just devolves into shouting. And I'm not in this position to shout. I'm in this position to accomplish things. And I will do what I need to do that without compromising my core principles. I'll always say what I think.
Presumably there are a lot of people here, particularly our students, who would like to be civic leaders. The attractiveness of running for office is getting less and less. It's tough. As you know, raising the money is brutal. The lifestyle, if you're doing the job right, is often brutal, and so on. So my fear is that as politics gets more tribal and running for office gets less pleasant, not that it was ever terribly pleasant, that the good people step back, try and lead in other ways, and it creates a vacuum.
Yeah.
You see it in Congress a lot on both sides.
Yeah.
And that it could be a vicious cycle where fewer good people run, they do other things, more charlatans step in the breach because you get more social media followers and so on. So for our students, how can we break through that cynicism and make it something attractive again to seek public office?
I can understand that, and I had a very nice conversation with a young woman. I don't know if she's here, or just in the lobby of the Rockefeller Center earlier today, and she's having to fight her own sense of cynicism because she's so upset with acts that the Trump administration is taking. And my belief has always been that if you cede the ground, if you cede the territory, the other side's not going to. They will be there and they'll take whatever you give them. And so if you believe in something firmly, then you have all the motivation you need to do it. And I will say this, that being the person who's running for office is not right for every person. There are people for whom they take it personally, not too personally, because there's no way you can't take it personally.
Because millions of people are like, we don't like you.
And I'm just a supremely rational person where, like, if you go look at any tweet I'll put up a picture of Leah with her puppy, and I will get the nastiest comments. I'm like, that's my cute daughter and her cute dog. What are you even talking about? But if I then put something up about substantive work, like, if you look at Twitter, it's just like a cesspool. But the way I look at it is, there are 11 million people in North Carolina. I won 55% of the vote, 40% didn't vote for me. That 7 million people, that's like nearly 3 million people didn't vote for me. Actually, it was 2 million. 2 million people didn't vote for me. 2 million people is a lot of people. And if 1% of them is really pissed at what I just said on Twitter, that's 20,000 people. So if I only get 200 ugly comments, that's like 1/10 of 1%. Like, what do I got to worry about? And so but it takes a rational person to think of it that way and not to feel the venom that they try to inflict in you. Blocking also helps. That's a good strategy. So I encourage people who have the personality type, whether it's ability to compartmentalize, ability to not take things personally, ability to forget. Like, I have a bad memory, which helps me because when people say bad things, I really don't remember 6 months later. So if you have that kind of personality and you really care and want to do something, then politics really is for you. I find what I do immensely rewarding, just immensely rewarding. I love it, and I'm glad I do it, even in this kind of messed up world in which we are living.
Can we actually follow up on that in terms of the ethos behind what drives you to do what you do as a public servant? You were the first person of Jewish faith to win a statewide office back when you were the AG, and now the first person of Jewish faith to be the governor. And I read a little bit on your background, talked about your father and the whole concept of tikkun olam,
right.
to heal the world, and wanted to talk about how that sort of how you follow that, what that means to you in terms of your governing and sort of reaching out to your constituents.
So, in Charlie's bio, it said, I was influenced by my faith and my family, and they're kind of one and the same. My dad, we moved to North Carolina. I had just been born. He just finished law school at GW, and he got an NAACP fellowship LD Legal Defense Fund Fellowship to join an African-American solo practitioner in Charlotte by the name of Julius Chambers, who became one of the best lawyers of the second half of the 20th century. And that was North Carolina's first integrated law firm. And they did the nation's leading school integration case, the nation's leading school employment non-discrimination case. They did the nation's leading voting rights cases. They did the nation's leading gerrymandering cases. They were the premier private civil rights law firm in the country. And so I was just raised that is what you do. You're on this earth to heal the world. That's what tikkun olam, as you noted, means in the Jewish faith. And so whatever your talents or interests are, it could be you love children and it's being a teacher, as Leah may want to be, or it may be you care about health policy, which Anna has done for her career. It's like whatever floats your boat and what your personality type, your interests, your skills, your passions are, go do that in the context of trying to make a contribution to the community you live in. And politics is the way I do that. But people say, how did you get into what you do? And I've never have really felt like a choice. Like there's a through line on the different types of jobs I've had, which have been fairly diverse, but it's all sort of like trying to do something to be a positive contributing member to wherever I'm living. And that's because of my family.
And we should point out for those who go to trivia night at Dunk's, there are 3 Jewish governors all named Josh at the right. Isn't that right?
Yeah,
Oh, that's right.
there are
Josh
six Jewish governors, 3 of whom are named Josh.
Okay. All right, that'll win you know.
3 Jewish Joshes. It is kind of funny.
Okay, we're going to go to the audience for questions. As I said at the outset, we're going to give priority to students. So somebody right there with the Dartmouth sweatshirt, which is a very good strategy.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Atticus. Thank you so much for coming. I'm from Nashville, and
North Carolina or Tennessee?
Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm just wondering, as coming from a state that's overwhelmingly red, a state that borders North Carolina, state that borders another state with a Democratic governor, Andy Beshear in Kentucky, how do you fight politicians in Tennessee who run on red meat issues and win groups of people who seem to need certain policies that Democrats champion, public health care, cheaper health care, public education? How do you fight the red meat issues and, I guess, work towards a Democratic Party that is going to be stronger in the South? Like, I don't know. And that it kind of goes to the political messaging question earlier. It's just, it doesn't seem to make sense. So I'm kind of wondering.
I hear what you're saying, and I don't know the intricacies of Tennessee politics, but I mean, it's the same story, honestly, in South Carolina and Alabama, Mississippi, where it's just so red, it becomes hard to even imagine the possibility of winning a race. And then it becomes a vicious cycle at that point, because if people don't have a belief that it's possible, then even if it were possible and you had the right candidate, folks won't join the team, and then you lose. I mean, as I mentioned, I won by 13,000 votes in 2020, and if I had lost that attorney general race, then it's likely I wouldn't be the governor today. So I don't have a real good answer for you in the way, but I do think about it the same way, because we obviously cannot give up on the South if we as a Democratic Party want to have national viability. I mean, if you look basically from Virginia, Kentucky, Arkansas, Texas, that swoop, and then down, everyone, there are only 2 Democratic governors in the whole collection of states, Kentucky and North Carolina. There are 2 Democratic United States senators from Georgia and from Virginia, but that's pretty much it. So we cannot give up on the South if we as Democrats, if we want to be nationally viable. That's where everyone's moving. The 3 fastest growing states in the country are Florida, Texas, and North Carolina. And New York's like the fastest depleting, depopulating. So it's going from blue to red, and we have the same issue writ small when it comes to the legislative races. Now, they are severely gerrymandered, which makes it really hard to win them. But we cannot give up on the small rural legislative districts if we ever want to take back the General Assembly in North Carolina, which I desperately want to do. So then it comes to how do you win those votes? And you have to be able to get over people's natural suspicion of the Democratic Party. There's just this sense that the Democratic brand in rural parts of this country don't care about rural people, that they don't connect with them, that they're concerned about issues that aren't relevant to them. And I don't believe that's true, obviously. I mean, the issues I was talking about, economic opportunity, healthcare, public safety, these are issues that, frankly, Democrats and Republicans and unaffiliated voters all believe in. And you just have to be a trusted messenger in carrying that message. Even though our congressional districts are so incredibly gerrymandered, I won 10 of them. I won 10 of 14. I won counties that Democrats haven't won in decades. And so you can do it. It just takes the right messaging and a lot of means to communicate that messaging effectively.
All right, let's go over to this side right here in the front.
Hi, Governor. Thank you for this amazing lecture. I'm Alex, Dartmouth 26 student, and I'm actually a Ukrainian American,
Oh
so
my
I'm
gosh.
a dual citizen.
Oh my gosh.
So speaking on that and about recent Zelensky's visit and interaction with Trump, what's your vision or foresight into the future of U.S. support or lack thereof of Ukraine?
Well, I'm a governor. I'm not in the U.S. Congress. And so I don't have any policy levers on this issue, but I'm an American as well. And I was raised with American values, which is that you believe in, embrace democracy, and you fight fascism and authoritarianism. And Putin is an authoritarian. He led Russia to invade an independent democratic nation in Ukraine. And it breaks my heart to see this country join in votes at the United Nations where the allies are United States, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, arrayed against the rest of the world. That is not the America I believe in, and I believe is who we are. It's just not being expressed at our highest levels of leadership, and it distresses me. I just joined a statement with a bunch of other Democratic governors decrying what happened to President Zelensky in the White House today. It breaks my heart. And what's going on in Ukraine breaks my heart.
Let's go right here. Another Dartmouth pullover there, and the necktie. Both. Both very.
Hello, thank you very much for coming, Governor. I am a 28 from New York, and I just wanted to ask, I've had the opportunity to learn more about the federal budgeting process, and that's very interesting. But one of the biggest ways in which state politics differs from federal politics is that most states, I believe North Carolina included, are not capable of going into debt, have to balance the budget.
That's right.
So I'd be curious if there are any particularly memorable budget fights in which you participated either as a governor or as a state senator, and if there are any particularly difficult choices you've had to make about funding because you didn't have the opportunity of taking on debt.
Yes, it's a great question, and you're correct. States cannot debt finance their budgets. They have to balance their budget every year. States don't print currencies, only the United States Treasury does. And so the federal government can go into debt, states cannot. The first year I was elected to the state senate was election of 08, so I went in 09. And if you're young, you don't remember it. Gray heads in the room remember. 2009 was just a disaster. It was the greatest recession since the Great Depression. And our state budget in North Carolina, we had a 25% hole, $5 billion out of what was then a $20 billion budget. Far and away, the greatest expenditure by the state with state dollars is public education. So you cannot shrink a 25% hole without cutting what I think is the most important investment the state makes, which is in K-12 education and in our young people's future. And so we had to do things to public education that tore me up, and then we politically paid a very bad price for that in 2010 because people were so upset with the consequences of those cuts from this global recession brought on by the housing bubble. The Republicans won power in 2010. First time in 130 years they'd controlled the state Senate in North Carolina, and then they used that power exceptionally effectively to gerrymander the new maps going after the last census, and they've locked in their partisan advantage ever since. We are the most egregiously gerrymandered state in the nation, which means that when you look at the vote, what percentage of people voted for a Democratic member of the state House and a Democratic member of the state Senate. By the way, a majority voted for a Democrat in both instances, and yet we're in the super minority in the state Senate and in near super majority in the state House. One vote shy, we broke the super majority by one vote. And our U.S. congressional delegation is 10 Republicans and 4 Democrats in a state that I won with 55% of the vote. And so I've now sort of told a story of political woe from a story of financial woe that was, it was terrible having to deal with that kind of financial crisis. I'm very concerned in North Carolina. We're doing our budget as we speak, and I'm working on my budget. And we've had a good fiscal year this year, a couple $100 million above projections. Next year, it's going to be estimated to be about projection. The year after that, it's an $800 million shortfall, nearly $1 billion of a $30 billion budget, in what I've already said is the 3rd fastest growing state in the country. And we have a growing economy. We have a very strong economy in North Carolina, diversified. And it's only because Republicans have pre-programmed in tax cuts for personal income taxes and corporate income taxes that they're creating a fiscal crisis, creating a fiscal cliff, because their commitment is to rewarding out-of-state shareholders instead of investing in in-state children. And I think it's a bad decision.
We'll go back to this. Oh, no, you guys were slow. Right here in the front. Oh, wait, they found somebody with a mic back there. We've been superseded.
It's all good.
Hi, I got to talk to you in class.
I can't
this
see you,
morning.
but are you my Robbinsville friend?
Yes.
Okay, good.
You're
Right on the
bathed
money.
in light.
You're the only one who would know. I know we've talked about gerrymandering a lot, and that's something that every time it's discussed at Dartmouth in class, North Carolina is used as an example. And I was just wondering your thoughts on how we as a state could combat that.
Really, there's only 2 ways for us to defeat partisan gerrymandering. One is the same way we did 2 years ago, which was there was a state case in state court before the state Supreme Court, and state Supreme Court ruled that partisan gerrymandering violated our state constitution because the U.S. Supreme Court said we're out of this game. This is what we call non-justiciable political question. The courts are not the right forum to deal with it. It's only the legislature. But that makes no sense to me. It's like saying when the fox is guarding the hen house, only the fox gets to decide who gets to guard the hen house, because legislators are always going to have a self-interest, even against the will of the voters. But in that Supreme Court case in 2018, which was a North Carolina case, by the way, in the U.S. Supreme Court, Roberts wrote, this doesn't apply to state constitutions and state Supreme Courts. And so it was relitigated after the 2020 census. The North Carolina Supreme Court, I wrote a brief for myself as AG and then governor, arguing that there's a free elections clause in the North Carolina Constitution that does not exist in the U.S. Constitution, and talked about that in equal protection. And the courts agreed with us and struck down the maps, forced redrawing, which is why our congressional delegation had been 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans, 50-50 in a 50-50 state. Well, in 2022, the Republicans won back control of the state Supreme Court. And then they reconsidered the decision they just rendered 5 months earlier. No change in the facts, no change in the law from above, just a change in the partisan composition of the court. And they said, nope, the legislature can do whatever they want. And so these maps that we ran on in 2024 were actually worse than the ones in 22. And now we have a 10-4 congressional delegation instead of a 7-7. And by the way, those 4 seats are the difference between Hakeem Jeffries being Speaker of the House and Mike Johnson being Speaker of the House. So if you want to know if this affects the country, there you go. So we need to win back the North Carolina Supreme Court to have it reconsidered and make the arguments there. The other solution, which would, I think, be the preferred solution because it would affect both partisan gerrymanders by Republican states and Democratic states, is to have Congress to pass a law banning partisan gerrymandering, which under the 14th Amendment it can do.
I have a follow-up process question, which is you talked about primaries and getting primaried being a disincentive to compromise. Have you given thought to open primaries like Alaska, where everybody runs in a single primary? You got to appeal to every voter in every election, and is that something that could force people to be, I guess, more moderate and broadly encompassing in their view?
That could work. North Carolina being one of the oldest democracies within the country, we don't have the ability for citizens to get referendum before the voters to modify the Constitution. All constitutional amendments have to go through the foxes that I was talking about guarding the hen house. And so the Republican legislature, by the way, our President Pro Tem, who I talked about earlier being this powerful politician, when he was in the state Senate in the minority, which he was in the noughts, every year he introduced a constitutional amendment prohibiting partisan gerrymandering, and then he got power in 2009, and he said, I've changed my mind.
All right. Let's go way in the back right there. You won't have to walk very far.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to Dartmouth. It's been really great listening to you speak. My name is Casey, and I'm from Illinois, which, you know, isn't a monolith, but is a pretty solidly Democratic state. So I'm just curious, as the governor of a swing state, how you adjust your messaging to a more politically diverse state to appease as many constituents as possible while maintaining your policy platform. And then also as a follow-up to that, like, do you feel like you're constrained in what you can say by the political demographics of your state more than you would if, you know, you were J.B. Pritzker?
Were I J.D. Pritzker with his $6 billion, that'd be all right. I would say anything I believed at that point. I do think that there's, your brain gets trained differently when you have to persuade people. And when you don't have to persuade people, you can have your views and beliefs, and they may not be as rigorously formed because pretty much the people around you also believe the same way you do. So you just, in a swing state, you have to spend your time thinking about how can I make this argument that's going to move the median voter? And so that's what I do. It doesn't change necessarily what I believe, but I'm just thinking about how do I talk about this in a way that folks will connect with? Because there's no point in talking about something that people don't agree with if it's going to not advance the issues you care about.
And just as a fellow Illinoisan originally, we had, before you were born, sadly.
There's a Republican governor from Dartmouth.
I mean, yeah, like, well, that would more, but going back, we probably had 5 Republican governors in a row. It was a state, like many states, where it was consistently dominated at the legislative level by Democrats, like Massachusetts, and then Republican governors. So there is, around the country, some of the most popular governors.
How many of them went to prison?
Only 3 or 4.
3 or 4, yeah. Something like 4 of 5 Illinois governors ended up in prison. I'm like, I am not being governor of Illinois. But one of them who didn't go to prison was a Republican.
Bruce Browner, yeah.
Dartmouth, his name's on the library.
But I think my larger point is there are a lot of successful governors.
Yeah, from the opposite.
From the opposite party, in part because of what you just said.
What's interesting is if you look around the country, the only states, Washington, Oregon, and Delaware, they're the only 3 that have elected more Democratic governors than North Carolina. We have won 8 of the last 9 governor's races, Democrats have. 8 of the last 9. I mean, you look at the Socialist Republic of Vermont, like they got a Republican governor. Like you look at Massachusetts, you look at Maryland, all these blue states, Rhode Island, there have been more Democratic gubernatorial success in North Carolina than any of those states. And I think that part of it, and that also actually overlapped. There were periods of that time, about half the time, Democrats were in control of the legislature. But there is something about North Carolina, even before we became more Republican on the federal side, there's just this inherent sense of moderation. It's like focus on the bread and butter. Make sure that you're educating your people. Make sure you have good infrastructure. We used to have the worst roads. Then we prided ourselves on having the best roads. Now they're above average roads. But invest in the core things that make success, and that's what voters reward.
So we got time for one more. We'll come down front. But in the meantime, in defense of Illinois, I want to say
He's going.
that Donald Trump pardoned Rod Blagojevich. So I don't know
he did.
how that counts in your arithmetic.
So I would say he's no longer a felon, but he was convicted of a felony.
And he did serve a lot of time in prison.
Yes.
He did.
Thank you, Governor. It was a pleasure to listen to you. So, my name is Arif. I'm from Stockholm, Sweden, but originally from Afghanistan. Well, my question has one domestic element and one foreign policy element. So, the American administration under the Trump, the new American administration under Trump leadership has have a huge shift in the foreign policy. I know you're a governor, but I will coming to domestic part of that. So in terms of like leveraging economic forces, imposing tariffs on its allies, and at the same time backing from its quote unquote shared national security interests and also shared values. So how do you think that if the trend continues, that would really put the U.S. in a position that it will lose its allies? And do you think that if that trend continues, even if new Democrat administration is in power, they could reverse the course of action and regain the trust of its allies and confidence? And secondly, how a potential tariff wars with different countries, Europe, China, and Canada would impact the consumers and also producers in North Carolina, and what policies do you have on the table in order to mitigate the implications of these tariffs and to help your constituencies? Thank you.
Great question. I think the question, whether you're talking about foreign policy and the way our historic allies look at us, but it's the same concept of what he's doing to agencies that matter to us domestically. He's basically turning the table and flipping it upside down. And when you assume, whether it's 4 years or 8 years, at some point a Democrat will be reelected president. You turn the table upside down, you put the tablecloth back on, but you're never going to get it back the way it was. Our allies will never look at this country the same way ever again. And countries that are not close allies of ours, but for whom there are strategic reasons why we want to have greater, closer relations, now have to ask themselves, do I want to go into a U.S. orbit or a Chinese orbit? Where is my long-term strategic interest? The one thing about China is they will have a consistent policy for at least for a period of time. So I'm very concerned that there's certain damage that's being done we won't ever be able to undo. The amount of damage that's been done, just as one minuscule example, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, this agency that exists to protect people, consumers in financial dealings with institutions. You can quibble whether it went too far in a certain case or not a certain case, or they should have issued a rule instead of a guidance, but the evisceration of what is going on, it's going to be very hard to ever build it back, which isn't to say it can't happen. So I don't want to be Pollyannish and say, all we have to do is win the next election and we can get things back to the way they were. I think it's going to be a long, hard slog. Much easier to tear down a building than it is to build a building. And then as it relates to the tariffs, we had 150,000 houses either destroyed or severely damaged in Western North Carolina. I mean, it's just hard for me to communicate through words the scale of the devastation. We're desperately trying to get federal funding and state funding to start the reconstruction process. Many people didn't have flood insurance because who thinks to have flood insurance in the mountains? Only 4% of houses out there that were damaged we think had flood insurance. So they don't have an ability to pay through insurance. A lot of people don't have money. laying around to rebuild a house that they've just lost. And so this is why the federal government has disaster relief, and we've done this historically. I can give you 5 different examples where the federal government has come in a meaningful way to help a devastated region recover. We need lumber to rebuild these houses. Our biggest support or source of lumber, other than domestic, is Canadian lumber. So if there's a 25% tariff on Canadian lumber, that just means that the prices of all of these houses are going to go up, 10 to 20%, whatever the share of the overall construction of the lumber is. I'm very concerned about that.
Got it. With that, so thank you very much for your service, for coming back. Thank you, Duck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.